I was struggling to equate the irritating but unremarkable encounter he described. I had doubtlessly forgotten to bust my own tray once or twice, though I didn't admit to that now. With a profound anger still coursing through him, a few hours and a few joints later, I felt guilty for being unable to do so. For lacking the empathy required to connect a careless prep school slight to a fundamental flaw in the social construct in which we lived. All I said was, "That sucks, dude." Jeff Hobbs, page 134, The Sweet and Tragic Life of Robert Peace. This quote shows how a preppy person just can't relate to Robert. Robert had a tough life. I will show this in my time with you. I will show what happened in Robert's life and what happened in the book. As well as those two, I will give my opinion and show the importance of this story. Robert was an extremely smart kid with some underlying issues that weren't always his fault. His surrounding ultimately led to his death. This is the short and tragic life of Robert Peace. To start out by summarizing his life, Robert was born and raised in one of the poorest and dangerous cities, Newark, New Jersey at the time. Robert was teased as a child for being a quote-unquote nerd and would be pressured into being tough. He learned to act different around people to fit in. Robert had a weird relationship with his dad, in fact. He idolized him even when he was charged with a double homicide. Because of this, he turns into an angry kid, but he hides it well from his peers. He attended Yale and once again excelled in school just like in high school. However, after he graduated with flying colors, he fell into a troubling time and moved back to Newark and began selling drugs. At only 30, he was shot in a drug deal. In a case, he had a good chance to leave his past behind, but he just fell back into the troubling ways he grew up in. To summarize the plot of the story quick, the book was written by Jeff Hobbs, a classmate of Robert at Yale. The book starts with the birth of Robert, who is born into a family where the mom, Jackie, is always concerned that Robert will turn to the street life, as he was raised in Newark, New Jersey, where at the time the drug availability was high and so were crime and street violence. He was noticed to be very smart and easily. He was noticed to be very smart at an early age, but also observed to have a moody personality. His father, Robert, but better known as Skeet, tried to teach his son about the street life, things like sports, boxing, and rap. His father was later sent to prison for a double homicide charge, but he said that the justice system was stacked against him. Seeing what the street life can do to persons, Robert's mother took up another job and sent her son to private school. At school, Robert wasn't able to make very many friends due to his so-called nerdy personality. He had to put on a face just to fit in. But once he finally got out of high school, he ended up having incredibly good grades and was offered to go to college by a plethora of Ivy League schools and very good schools of that sort. He didn't have any money to go into those schools, but a person from St. Benedictine School offered to pay his full tuition, no questions asked. So he went to Yale, no questions asked. At Yale, he found that most of the students there were really privileged, and he didn't really fit in with them. And he generally just hung out with the people that were kind of like him as much as he could at Yale, and seemed to just smoke weed with everyone else and tries best to forget about everything. He was majoring in one of the most hardest things to major in at Yale, which was biology. He excelled in this, of course, being a very smart person. But when he wasn't doing that, he was smoking marijuana and selling it to his classmates, which makes it even more impressive that he was doing so well in his major. He ended up graduating and always thought that he wanted to go to graduate school, but he never got around to it and never applied. He then moved back to Newark, New Jersey, and with his friends got back to the street life. He started to sell marijuana and sell things like that sort to people just trying to make money, and he took up a really poor teaching job just teaching biology. And while his money that was made during his time in college selling drugs to his classmates, when he gave it to a friend and went back to Newark, that friend actually took all the money, which was $100,000, and just used it to pay off his debts. That's why Robert got the low-paying job, because he was just mad at everything and he didn't care. He just wanted to live his life, do nothing, and just get by. But eventually, one night, when him and his friend were in the living room of their house, smoking weed and just sitting on the couch, they heard a knock at the door. Robert opened it, and people stormed in the house, brought him to the basement where he kept all his illegal drug paraphernalia and weed. They shot and killed him and stole all the weed and left. His friend that was in there with him just sat there in awe. To move to my opinion on the book and some recommendations, Robert's identity as some hood kid from Newark affected him in college, arriving as known as a weird kid with a reputation that wasn't so good, and also he began to be judged by his peers. A big difference between me and Robert would have to be our bringing up. I was brought up in a suburban school and neighborhoods, while Robert was brought up in a bad town and a bad school at first as well. But we did both go to private schools, which is the similarity. In his childhood, it was considered soft to be smart, and that's the contrary in my life. The identity of a person from a bad town attending Yale brought discrimination upon Robert. My appearance doesn't give me many struggles, but it does make me sound like a nice kid with no problems sometimes. The author's goal with this story was to inform the reader that even with all the tools and smarts, people with rough backgrounds can struggle to leave these scenarios. The author wants Robert's story to live on as an example to people who could be in a similar scenario, to do their best to leave the bad life they grew up in. The author wants us to know that Robert was a good person at heart, but he was never able to fulfill his dreams, and the author wants us to complete ours. He doesn't want us to fall back into the bad holes that everyone has in their lives. He wants us to move forward. In the book, Robert writes, "So what if it's annoying as hell? Instead of sitting around here bitching about it, maybe we can just accept it. That is what it is, and know that we have the capacity to get way more from them than they'll ever get from us." Robert Peace, found on page 147, The Short and Tragic Life of Robert Peace. This quote talks about racism and is one of the tones of the book. Some loaded words are, "Just accept it," on page 147. Another loaded word is, "And everyone here is privileged," all found on page 125. The author is trying to prove a point. Overall, this was an amazing book, and everyone should read it to understand more about perspectives. Thank you. In conclusion, Robert was an extremely smart kid with some underlying issues, but they weren't always his fault, and his surrounding ultimately led to his demise. His story can teach us not to judge a book by its cover, and always check with our friends because we don't always know what's going on. Robert says in the book, "And yet they still rendered the predictable media spin of potential squandered." Robert says in the book, "And yet they still rendered the predictable media spin-off potential squandered. Robert says in the book, and yet they still rendered the predictable media spin-off potential, squandered the gift of education, sacrificed the allure of thug life, etc. Not only simplistic but offensively. Robert Peace, page 164, The Short and Tragic Life of Robert Peace. And this shows why you shouldn't let a close one waste what opportunities they have. I showed you Robert's life, what happened in the course of my book, my thoughts on everything, and what his story means to us. This was The Short and Tragic Life of Robert Peace.